Hey everybody, it's Pastor John with the Midweek Moment for this week. What I'd like to talk to you about this week is a book that I am currently reading. The book is called Dear Mr. Brown. It's an old book. It was first published in 1961, and it's written by a guy named Henry Emerson Fosdick. And while that name may not ring a bell for many of you, when this book first came out in 1961, Henry Emerson Fosdick was one of the most famous people in America. In fact, ever since the late 19-teens, Henry Emerson Fosdick had really been one of the spokespeople for what came to be called liberal or mainline Protestant Christianity in America. He had been for many, many years the minister in the Riverside Church in New York City. And he was an author, widely published author. In fact, there's a list of the other books that he's published in here, and it's that long. So he was an author, he was a lecturer. You're actually familiar with something that Henry Emerson Fosdick did, because he was the author of the hymn God of Grace and God of Glory, a hymn that we sing pretty frequently here in church. And this book, Dear Mr. Brown, I find this book extremely interesting, and I do so for two reasons. The first reason I find it interesting is that, like I said, it was first published in 1961. And which means, I guess, that Fosdick was probably writing it maybe 1959, 1960 into 1961. And if you know anything about American history, you know that period, the very late 50s and the very early 60s, was the absolute high point of mainline Protestant Christianity in America. That was the moment when churches like ours, like the United Church of Christ, or the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, or the Presbyterian Church USA, or the United Methodist Church, reached our most influential point in American history. That time, that just few period of years in the late 50s and the early 60s was the period when, believe it or not, churches like ours absolutely dominated American religion. In fact, if you want a visual symbol of how powerful that denomination was, you can just go to Manhattan and go to the Riverside Church, because right across the street from the Riverside Church, there's a building called the Interchurch Center. It was built in right about this time, the late 50s, early 60s. And it was built to be sort of a mainline Protestant Vatican. It was going to be the place where all the mainline Protestant churches had their headquarters. And that building was so important that when the cornerstone was laid in 1958, it was laid by President Dwight Eisenhower. That's how important churches like ours were in the late 50s and the early 60s. And that's in what I find it interesting that this book came out right exactly at that moment when mainline Protestant churches were at the zenith of their influence. The other thing that I find interesting about this book is that even though the churches like Fosdick's are at the zenith of their influence in the late 50s and the early 60s, Fosdick sees trouble on the horizon, because what this book is it takes the form of a series of letters between Fosdick and a guy named Ted Brown. Ted Brown really doesn't exist, but he is, as the bottom of the title page says, he is a person perplexed about religion. And there are a series of questions that Fosdick and Ted Brown discuss over the course of the book. Let's see, there are questions like, can you be good without God? Is Christian faith believable? Why not be an agnostic? How do you picture God? What about modern science and the Bible? How do we explain the world's evil? How can you surmount discouragement with the world? There are a whole series of questions in this book. And as I said, what I find interesting about it is that Fosdick realizes that even at this moment, when mainline Protestant churches are at their peak of influence and authority, that there's trouble on the horizon. And that there are a new generation of Americans who have questions about religion and questions about the world and questions about faith that their parents didn't have. And that if churches like Fosdick's, mainline churches, are going to continue to prosper into the future, they're going to need to be able to come up with answers for those questions. They're going to need to be able to to answer the questions that contemporary people have. They're not just simply going to be able to rely on what has always worked in the past. Which brings me to the last thing that I find interesting about this book, and that is that all the questions that Fosdick addresses in this book, a book that came out in 1961, mind you, are still questions that people have today. And there's still reasons that people give for not believing in God. There are reasons people give for not having faith in Christ. There are reasons people give for not being a Christian or not becoming part of a church. The Christian faith simply isn't believable. They look at the world and they find it too discouraging. They don't understand ideas like the Trinity and the atonement and things like that. They find those things, strange and weird and unbelievable. The thing about this book, like I said, is that over the past 60 years, mainline churches have done virtually nothing to address the questions that Fosdick addresses in this book, which means we've done virtually nothing to address the issues that a lot of people have today. In fact, the issues that Fosdick raises in this book may even be issues that you have. There may be questions that you've got about God or about the world or about science or something like that. And if you can find this book, and it's been out of print, well, it came out in 61, so I'd imagine it's been out of print since the early 70s. It's probably going to be a bit of a task to find, but if you can, I would really encourage you to find this book and to give it a read. Because like I said, the questions that Fosdick brings up in 1961 are the exact same questions that a lot of people are still asking in 2022. And so this might be a time when it would make sense for us to heed the wisdom of the ancients. Thanks.